Good morning, everyone, and a warm welcome to this BDB Pitmans webinar on the subject of clean air zones. My name is Tom Henderson. I'm a partner with BDB Pitmans, and I will be chairing today's session. For those of you who are not already familiar with BDB Pitmans, we are a full-service, multi-office law firm, which also offers a public affairs consultancy. And one of our particular areas of specialism is the delivery of complex infrastructure and regulatory projects, and we are the UK's leading law firm on clean air zones and related subjects, including road user charging and workplace parking levies. We are very proud to be working with a number of local authorities across the country to deliver clean air zones and related initiatives. And notwithstanding the effects of COVID-19, of course, the pursuit of clean air initiatives remains a priority for our towns and cities. Given that today is, by a happy coincidence, National Clean Air Day, it seemed to us a timely opportunity to host this webinar to share our experiences and perspectives on the subject and provide an opportunity to answer your questions. I'm joined today by three speakers. Firstly, we'll be hearing from Rahul Bijlani, who's a legal director with us at BDB Pitmans, and he's the leading practitioner in this field. Rahul leads our work on a number of clean air zones across the country, and he'll be talking about the fundamental building blocks and why schemes have come about. Secondly, we're very grateful to be joined by Ashley Baton, project manager at Bath and North East Somerset's Clean Air Zone. Ashley has over 30 years experience of managing a wide range of complex and high profile projects, and he'll be providing a valuable perspective from someone involved in the challenges and practicalities of delivering a clean air zone. Finally, we'll be hearing from David Mundy, a partner with BDB Pitmans, who specialises in public and regulatory law and infrastructure planning. David will be looking at the state aid aspects of clean air zones, an area often unseen at the outset of proposals and one on which he is supporting a number of local authorities. Before we get going, just some housekeeping points. We've allocated an hour for today's webinar, and that includes some time at the end to answer any questions that you may have. You're therefore very much encouraged to submit any questions that come to mind as the webinar unfolds, and we'll pick those up in Q&A at the end once we've heard from all of our speakers. Note that whilst we speakers can see and hear from each other, your cameras and microphones are not enabled, so nobody on today's webinar will be able to see or hear from you. And therefore, to submit a question, please can you use the Q&A button on your toolbar, and that way others will be able to see the questions that are being posed. The chat function will not be visible to other participants, so please can I ask that you only use this function if you're encountering technical difficulties, and my colleague Melissa will endeavour to deal with those. So without further ado, I'll now hand over to our first speaker, Rahul Bijlani. Rahul, I think you're on mute, if you can unmute yourself.
Thanks, Tom. Classic Zoom error. Great way to start. Thank you, Tom. Yeah, as Tom's mentioned, I'm not only working on a number of clean air zones in England at the moment, but I've actually been working on clean air zones since before there were clean air zones, which sounds odd, but is in fact true, because one of the messages I'd like you to take away today is that not only are we facing a number of authorities being mandated with clean air zones, but actually the legal processes, the powers available, the technology to implement a zone of this kind have been around for 10 or 20 years. I was working on the London low emission zone way back in 2009 and the ultra low emission zone after that. And really, these powers are extremely flexible. They are very localized and evolved, and it is open to a number of authorities to take this sort of approach on a voluntary basis. So that's sort of an initial thought to bear in mind. Melissa, if we could have the next slide. So this is what I'm going to be covering today. It'll be a brief canter through these, as there are some fairly big issues. I'm going to look at why we have clean air zones right now, some of the issues that face local authorities, the legal framework, as I mentioned, which actually is more flexible than just a clean air zone, basics of implementing a zone, focusing on a couple of points there, some summary on dealing with government, although Ashley's really going to pick that up in more detail. And I'd like to leave you with a couple of thoughts on the impact of COVID-19, something which is hard for any of us to avoid at the moment. So diving in, next slide, Melissa. just before we get started, really, just so we're all on the same page, we're talking here about charging clean air zones, where charges are imposed on vehicles which don't meet specified emission standards, which for UK government and England clean air zones are Euro 4 petrol, Euro 6 diesel. Typically, different charges are imposed for light and heavy vehicles. There are penalty charges for non-payment, and enforcement is via automatic number plate recognition. For mandated CASs, there is a framework of 4 classes, A being the lightest touch to D being all vehicles, including private cars. And although not part of the CAS, typically, as part of the package, funding is made available to mitigate the impacts of the clean air zone and to help owners of vehicles upgrade to meet the relevant standards. Next slide, please. So why are we seeing this proliferation of clean air zones now? Well, it's down to the fact that the UK government had and has an obligation under the Air Quality Directive to meet certain specified limit values for pollutants, including NO2, and it failed to do so. Client Earth therefore took them to court, the government to court 3 times, successfully on each occasion. The key judgment being number 2, which established that the UK government must put in place policies to achieve compliance as soon as possible. And that second bullet point there, which was something of an invention of the court or an interpretation by the court, to choose a route to compliance which reduces human exposure as quickly as possible. And that has caused some problems. I'd like to return to that briefly. What that led to was in 2017 a plan for reduction of NO2, which effectively identified local areas where there were exceedances and required local authorities to achieve compliance as soon as possible. The way this was done was that directions were issued under the 95 Act, saying to local authorities, you must achieve compliance and, if necessary, you must implement a clean air zone. And the CAS framework, as I mentioned, sets out what the government expects in that regard. Next, please, Lisa. Now that has left local authorities in a very difficult position. All of that process risk has been transferred to local authorities. It's a government obligation, but now local authorities have to deal with the process. Also, the risk of the challenges being transferred. And it's a 2-pronged risk. Those who are affected by a clean air zone, hauliers, bus operators, for example, are likely to want more time to comply, lower standards. On the other hand, Earth have now turned their attention from central government to local government. They are seeking to ensure that equity by pressuring local government to adopt the most stringent standards. So if you go for a CAS D, C as a local authority, Earth will ask you why you haven't gone for a CAS D. Would that not, for example, reduce human exposure more quickly? And it's a difficult argument, which leads on to the next point, which is options of proportionality. It's that the options appraisal process for authorities has been very difficult. Government guidance is not very clear. It's not clearly reflected the legal principles established in the Client Earth Model 2. And what that case doesn't say is you must reduce human exposure as quickly as possible, unless that would have negative social economic impacts. So local authorities find themselves in the bind. They have more general duties, and there could be actions you could take to reduce NO2. What are the negative impacts? So this is a narrow path local authorities must tread. The legislation, which I've mentioned, is not new, has not always been modified to suit. For example, authorities are required to use vehicle classes, which are UK classes, not the relevant European classes, which would work for European emission standards. There's been a lack of clarity nationally. Some of you will be aware that Leeds and Birmingham had to put their schemes on hold while the national payment portal designed to accept payments was brought up to speed. Funding is, of course, a vexed issue. These schemes are expensive, and I think Ashley will touch on the funding process. And as Tom mentioned, we're going to cover state aid as well. That's another live issue which David will address. And the next slide, please. So just to return to that legal framework I've mentioned a few times, it's the Transport Act 2000, so a relatively old act now, which allows for the introduction of these schemes, and it actually allows for any road user charges scheme. The Dartford Crossing, for example, is in fact a road user charges scheme, using the same legislation as Clean Air Zone we use. Likewise, Durham, the picture there you see is of Sadler Street, I believe, in Durham, and they've used it to control entry to an element, an area of the historic city centre. Oxfordshire are proposing a zero emission zone in Oxford, which will be slightly different to a clean air zone and is voluntary, but again uses the same legislation. And I guess the message I'd like to convey is that this is a very powerful process. It's an order-making procedure. It's entirely devolved locally. There is no role for central government. And there are existing regulations governing things like penalty charges, enforcement, which you can plug into and which make that aspect of the process more straightforward. So next slide, please, Mr. So in the legal sense, legal side funding for the moment, making a clean air zone or low emission zone is actually relatively straightforward. Any local traffic authority may make a scheme. That does require a little bit of thought. We've seen examples of directions issued by central government to city councils rather than county councils, who in fact have the powers to implement a zone. So you do need to think who the appropriate promoter of a scheme is. I'll touch on what an order of the charging authority is and what the content must be, but I'd just like to highlight the why point there. A scheme may be made for the purpose of directly or indirectly facilitating the achievement of local transport policies. Now that's actually a very broad set of purposes. It can of course encompass clean air, it can encompass congestion charging, it can encompass simply raising revenue for other transport purposes. You could argue that if you wanted to invest in cycle or bus infrastructure, you could indirectly facilitate that by raising revenue by charging cars, which would also have potentially environmental or congestion impact. So actually, the legislation there is incredibly flexible. The next slide, please. It's flexible legislation. It's also relatively light touch. There are some requirements for what an order must do. It must specify the roads involved, the class of motor vehicle, and the charges imposed. And there have been examples of authorities falling foul of even these minimal obligations. What it means for a clean air zone is you've got to be very clear about specifying your emission standards, Euro 4, Euro 6, which is more complex than you might think because there's a question of retrofit. There are vehicle classes where the boundaries are a little bit fuzzy. You've got to identify which vehicles are compliant and therefore don't pay. And you've got to identify properly exemptions and discounts. And again, we'll touch on that later. That's a little bit of a tricky point. There is a legal obligation to consult. Now, of course, where you have a mandated clean air zone, the zone is going to happen anyway, but consultation is still important because it is a risk mitigation point. You've got to ensure you comply with your public law duties. But where you're doing a voluntary zone, such as a zero emission zone, consultation becomes even more important because you need to bring the public along with you on that journey. 2 points there also to mention. Mentioned local policies already. Net proceeds may also only be spent on the achievement of local transport policies. So it's important to do a bit of an audit of those policies at the outset to ensure that your scheme meets those in terms of purposes, and anything you wish to spend the revenue on is supported by policy. Next, please. So in terms of the charging order, this is something we do an awful lot of. So we developed an expertise and a way of doing things. I'll take the right column first, just to mention there are minimal requirements in the 2000 Act, but you do need to be careful. The Mersey Gateway Order tried to specify a range of charges, and the Traffic Tribunal said, no, that's not good enough. You must specify the charge imposed. There are some thoughts about making the order. You may need to consider council procedures and timescales, how that relates to commencement and implementation. For example, charging may begin on day 1. You may want your order to be made with day 1 or day -60 or -90 to allow time for registration, for exemptions and discounts, for example. Plans are important because this is a quasi-legal instrument. If you don't comply with it, you can end up with penalties. So you've got to be very clear where the zone is. It's not as simple as drawing a big circle. There may be issues of turnbacks or where your cameras are placed, which may mean you need to consider the boundary very carefully. And all of this really means that an iterative process is desirable for preparing your charging order. I think with Bath, Ashley and I have worked on at least 10 or 12 drafts going back and forth to JAQU, and drafting the order helps to throw up issues in terms of how the technology will work, how the policy can be implemented. And there's no better way to flush these out than seeking to put something into a legally enforceable form. there's also the question of future-proofing. We try and draft our orders in a way which is as future-proofed as possible. So, for example, in the future, Euro 4 or 6 may not be the appropriate standard. You may wish to go for electric vehicles, for example. So we'll draft the order in an almost modular way so that you can sub in a new standard or a new class of vehicle or a new exemption, for example. Which takes me back onto the left-hand column. Exemptions are a particularly tricky issue. You may think, well, it's very easy to identify vehicles we don't want to pay. And some of them may be easily identified, for example, through DVLA data. An electric vehicle may be easy to identify, or there may be an existing statutory process which identifies a vehicle. If you're talking about local community vehicles, for example, you might effectively plug into the community transport permit process. But it's likely you'll want to consider exemptions on a more bespoke basis. And for those, we'd advocate a registration requirement, because if you are seeking to have an exemption where you may not know whether somebody's exempt, if your order says, well, if you meet these 4 criteria, you're exempt and you don't pay. But if you're not aware of those criteria and the number plate comes up and it's not within your list of exemptions, your white list, you'll issue a PCN and the recipient may reasonably say, well, hang on, I meet your criteria. So we'd advocate a registration process where you have to meet the criteria, but also have supplied evidence to the authority and appear on the register, which gives the authority a bit of a safety net there, so you're not enforcing unlawfully. The next slide, please, Melissa. So just a brief summary then of how this process goes. It starts out, in the case of a mandated clean air zone, with a direction under the Environment Act 95. I do apologise, I'll ignore the doorbell for now. The OBC and FBC processes are something Ashley will cover. That's the funding process. Consultation is important. Procurement, IT, and infrastructure work, again, Ashley will touch on this. This is a long process and will need to go on in the background. You make the charging order, which I've discussed, and then finally there is go live. So that is the brief sort of summary. It's even more straightforward, of course, if you're not mandated by government. Then you can skip some of the first 2 aspects, really. Next slide. And finally, I just wanted to touch briefly on the impact of COVID-19 and the future of clean air zones. There was an improvement in air quality and there was an impact on traffic, but it now seems as if private car traffic is almost back to normal. Freight transport may be in fact slightly above where it was. Fleet upgrades have been delayed. There is an increase in cycling. And I'd like to somewhat speculate really that now might in fact be a good opportunity for, if not more radical approaches, I perhaps shouldn't have used those words. I don't think clean air zones are particularly radical, but perhaps a step change in the way that air quality is managed in cities. What I've learned from the ultra low emission zone is that once these schemes are enforced, they become surprisingly popular. Consultations to tighten the ultra low emission zone, to bring forward the commencement date, to shorten the residence discount, all received positive support, 55% in the region, something in that region, support. And I think that's because the scheme worked. I think ultra low emission zone in London resulted in a 35 to 40% drop in NO2. People can see that, and I think that maybe now is a time, particularly when other clean air zones come into force, but there'll be opportunities to do more of this. London has always been considered to be different. Other cities now have mayors, but London has its unique transport infrastructure. But as we have clean air zones in other cities, I think this may mean that they become more and more publicly acceptable. And that, combined with a very broad set of powers, the ability to raise revenue, to use these zones for a range of purposes, could mean that we're entering an era where this becomes an opportunity for a lot of cities to make a positive impact on the air quality and health of their areas. And I think with that, I will hand over to Ashley to talk about the experiences of Bath and North East Somerset.
Thanks, Raoul. Melissa, if you just move to the next slide, that'd be great. Thank you. So I'm going to talk about, I'm not going to attempt to be a lawyer, but talk about the legal basis in sort of my language. Talk about the role of the Joint Air Quality Unit, then move on to, I think as Raoul hinted about, the idea of the sort of feasibility study and the business case development process. Just touch on the infrastructure delivery that we've done so far and what's remaining. And then the mitigations that we've put in place in Bath to support our residents and businesses. And the next steps from now to what's today been made public, which is our launch now on the 15th of March 2021. So Melissa, if you just can move to the next slide, thanks. So as Raoul has said, UK's got air quality legislation in place, which means that in technical speak, we've got to meet legal limits for nitrogen dioxide concentrations of 40 micrograms per cubic meter. And then it's complicated slightly by the fact that has to be as an annual mean. In Bath, we have air quality issues on a number of road links, and we estimate, it's difficult to estimate accurately, but that 92% of all NOx emissions are attributable to that road traffic. So it's it's a big issue for us. If we think about Bath's exceedances that it has at the moment, and if we did nothing, how long it would take to resolve those matters through essentially natural fleet upgrade, we would still continue to exceed that limit of 40 micrograms per cubic meter as an annual mean by well until 2025. So there was clearly a need to do something to intervene at some level to bring those nitrogen dioxide concentrations within legal limits. So on, as it says, the 27th of July, back in 2017, feels like a whole lifetime ago now, we received our first initial ministerial direction. We have had several then subsequently as we've sort of firmed up our plans. And that ministerial direction was very much focused on asking us to deliver a feasibility study. So just to do the kind of work to decide what we were going to do at that stage, and we then subsequently had further directions, sort of embodying in them, what work we were actually going to implement. But anyway, at that time, it was just a feasibility study to bring nitrogen dioxide levels to within legal limits. And then the crux of it really is one of the tests that Raoul mentioned in the Supreme Court ruling, was as soon as possible and by 31st of December 2018 at the latest, in terms of bringing that feasibility study forward. Melissa, could I have the next slide, please? Thanks. As a response to the Supreme Court ruling, DEFRA and DFT collaborated together and they set up the Joint Air Quality Unit. I think pretty much at the time that we were directed, they then set about developing guidance, which really came out as we were moving forward through our process. But the essence of it is that what that set out was a sort of three-case business case process. First part was a strategic outline business case that we had to develop. And what that did, it narrowed down all of the options that we could potentially consider to just be a short list of options. And then again, the crux, sort of referring back to the Supreme Court ruling, these things had to be likely, not just possible, to deliver compliance, and they had to deliver that compliance in the shortest possible time. It's really, really important, and that's driven the project all the way through so far. The process then was to take that strategic outline business case, progress it to an outline business case where we take that shortlist and narrow it down to one preferred option. I think some authorities, excuse me, a cat needs to be moved. Some authorities have potentially got 2 or 3 preferred options at this stage, which they've consulted on. We very much narrowed it down to one preferred option and then consulted on that preferred option from that initial shortlist. Then the full business case stage is really dotting I's and crossing T's, to be brutally honest. It's really setting out that preferred option in enough detail to be able to implement the scheme, and then moving forward to launch it in due course. This is a really important point, this sort of final point here on this slide. Those business cases that we developed were obviously checked and developed and kind of audited, I suppose, in-house by ourselves as the council. But also what happened was that the Joint Air Quality Unit looked at them And then on top of that, 2 independent review panels that the Joint Air Quality Unit formed also reviewed them. And I have to say, that process, although it sounds onerous, was very, very robust and ensured that we moved through those business case or through that business case process without kind of falling back all the time. So I'd very much embrace that. I know it sounds onerous, but I'd very much embrace it. Melissa, if you could just move on to the next slide, please. In terms of timeline and exactly what happened, and I think also picking up on Raoul's point about how we segue into sort of consultation and what have you, the SOBC that we delivered, so that strategic outline business case, we managed to turn around by March, so we turned that around fairly quickly. But what we did is, I have a bit of a thing, which is around, you know, if you're trying to get a message across to people, if you're trying to essentially sell something to people, people will go through a process of interest, understanding, commitment. And what we did is we used this business case process to align with that kind of philosophy. So at the starting point at the SOBC stage, where people might be sort of interested, we got out to the people that were really engaged, did some informal engagement with them as key stakeholders, and kind of had those initial conversations to sort of shape our messaging really, and also our thoughts around how the outline business case should then look. We then did a bit more modelling work, did a bit more business case development, and in September 2018, we then set out a preferred option, which was initially a Class D charging clean air zone, charging everything, including private cars. That caused some excitement, and we formally consulted on that and received an enormous 8,500 responses to our consultation. Bearing in mind the size of Bath, I think that blew any consultation that had ever been done out of the water in terms of responses, and was a little bit, frankly, overwhelming for the team in terms of then, you know, properly kind of taking that consultation information that had been returned from residents and businesses, understanding it, and then looking at how we might shape the scheme so that we can address some of the concerns that were raised. What that meant is then that we did miss our December 2018 deadline, but we did manage, after we'd processed everything, to deliver a final OBC by March 2019, and that set out a slightly different option. It set out an option of a Class C charging clean air zone, okay, but with traffic management in Queen Square, so a historic square in the centre of Bath. And what that enabled us to do was to then remove private cars from the equation. So it's kind of a bit of, you know, we'll need some traffic management, but on the other hand, we can then remove private cars from the equation. Interestingly, removing those private cars wasn't just something that car drivers wanted. Interestingly, it was something that the businesses wanted. They said, look, you know, we can deal with you know, issues of getting the goods in. What we need to do is ensure that the biz, you know, that our demand, I suppose, is there. You know, that we've still got people coming through the door. So that was widely supported, really, not only by car drivers, obviously, but also by the businesses who would still be affected. One important point there, though, is that we've not still taken the pressure off car drivers. We are still doing an enormous amount of work to just keep car drivers in the mix, even though we're not charging them. Anyway, moving on. We then had a change of administration, so it moved from Conservative to, sorry, Melissa, I'm moving on in a sense, could you just drop back onto the next point? We then had a change of administration from Conservative to Liberal Democrat, so again, something else to factor into your thoughts if you're thinking about a clean air zone and the timescales involved. They instructed an independent review, which we undertook, and finally we got round to them accepting kind of where we got to, and our final OBC and draft charging order going out for a further consultation in October 2019. We then understood that consultation response and delivered up a final full business case in January of this year. Thanks, Melissa. Let's go on this time. In terms of what we're delivering, as Raoul alluded to earlier, there's effectively the main component of the scheme is the ANPR cordon. But as I said earlier myself, you know, we're also combining it in this instance with a traffic management measure, essentially to deal with a particular hotspot that we have in Gay Street, which is just around the corner from Queen Square. That piece of work is now complete and operational, so that is done. The ANPR cordon is largely in and will be complete and operational by November. And then what we've done is we've put the sign bases in with then just the faces left to go up prior to the launch. Importantly, again, Raoul touched on it earlier, our infrastructure not only includes those sort of hard infrastructure measures or those physical infrastructure measures, we're also developing a back office IT system, largely built off systems that we already have, but customized essentially to not only accommodate a clean air zone, but also to accommodate integration with the government's own central IT system. What you'll also see out today, if you visited the vehicle checker that the government have launched a few, probably a year or so ago now, you'll now see Bath on that vehicle checker, and that again has gone live today as part of the process of moving towards this launch on the 15th of March next year. Melissa, please carry on. A big part of it really is, you know, we've talked about the stick measure, which is the charging zone itself, you know, but to bring people along with us and to not, you know, necessarily impact too much on businesses and residents, we have also launched a package of mitigations. Sorry, postman I knew would come at some point, really inconvenient. So I'm working with animals, working with dogs and cats. So we launched also a package of mitigations to try and minimise the impact on businesses and residents. We've done a bus upgrade programme, which is moving towards now a fully compliant scheduled bus fleet prior to the launch. A big piece of what we're doing is the financial assistance scheme. So we're supporting our businesses and residents with grants and interest-free loans to help them shift from non-compliant vehicles to compliant vehicles and avoid charging. We don't really, in this scheme, want to be charging people. We're also putting together a last mile delivery piece, which looks at moving cargo primarily off ICE vehicles onto cargo bikes and electric vans, enhancing our weight limit and anti-idling enforcement in and around the zone, and then really crucially, that's all the jam, I suppose, of the mitigations, but also as part of mitigations of the package of exemptions that we've got, which are supporting, in our thinking, vital services, disadvantaged groups, and those with hard to replace vehicles. And then we've got a quite complex, in the sense of, I can't really explain it today, but we can maybe talk about it after the session, what we've called a means tested general exemption as part of the financial assistance scheme. Happy to touch on that as part of Q&A if that helps. Melissa, do you want to carry on? Thanks. So in terms of next steps, is really to get this IT integration nailed and make sure that's delivered on time, and also at the same time make sure that, you know, the local scheme is fully aligned with the national government approach. And we all have to bear in mind the fact that this is, you know, this is a first, so we're all learning. So we have to allow a little bit of time in our thinking and in our programme, you know, for things to change, because they will, because no one's done it before. Massive part of what we're doing is having in place a team of transport and travel advisors. We have only got this far by taking the time to have a cup of tea with people, is the way we've played it. We're not pushing things online. I know other authorities just might have to in terms of the volume of people, you know, residents and businesses they've got to deal with. Sorry, postman again. But no, we've taken, because we're a relatively small authority, the view that we will, where we can, have a cup of tea with people and really talk them through the changes that need to be made and what support is available for them. We're also running, as we run up to launch, with a press and radio advertising campaign. And then crucially, again, I'll touch on this as part of Q&A if it's helpful, a soft enforcement process to help raise awareness for those drivers who are still in non-compliant vehicles when we're moving closer to launch. Final point, and then I'll hand over to David. It's important we make sure that this scheme is effective. So monitoring and evaluation has been core right from the start. And indeed the government, as I said here, are funding very detailed case studies of what we're doing, using Ipsos Mori. We've also got an extensive monitoring and evaluation routine that we're putting in place. And we've been baselining the scheme for a number of years now, which is all crucial stuff that needs to be thought about as people move forward through into clean air zones and other sort of road use charging measures like ours, I suppose. Thank you. That's me done, I think, Melissa. Just move on to the next slide. Touch wood. Sorry about the interruptions. David, I think you're going to talk about state aid. Is that right?
That's right, actually. Thanks for the introduction. Good morning, everybody. Yes, the question of state aid. There may be some furrowed brows to start with, I think, in simply trying to understand how state aid is relevant in these circumstances. The answer, I think, the simple thing to have in your mind is that it really applies in terms of mitigations and exemptions. So really in circumstances where, for example, a local authority is making funding available either by means of a loan or a grant to facilitate, for example, the purchase of a cleaner vehicle. Equally in circumstances where there is an exemption put in place for a particular class, for example, taxi drivers in an area, where, for example, they're trying to mitigate, the local authorities trying to mitigate the impact by exempting them and therefore potentially causing a competition law problem. So, Melissa, if we can move to the first slide, I'm afraid to kick off with, really, there has to be not too many groans, I hope, an introduction to state aid and really what it's all about. And again, fundamental thing to have in your mind, please, is we're talking about competition law, a level playing field, if you like, use the jargon, but noting therefore that state aid, so that is aid in the form, for example, of a grant or a loan, aid that distorts competition and affects trade between member states of the EU is prohibited, it's unlawful. There are various exemptions or gateways to make, in some circumstances, aid compatible with the internal market. And indeed, if it's compatible with the internal market, the aid is normally allowed. And how does it work? It works basically by a system of notification. So a body that is seeking to grant aid should really notify that proposal to the European Commission, and it's the Commission that has a primary role for assessing if the aid is compatible with the internal market, either that it's not actually going to disturb the internal market in such a way as to be material and therefore to be unlawful. So an emanation of the state, or the state, if you like, which would include local authorities, ordinarily should notify the Commission in good time and should not grant the aid in whatever form it might take until the Commission has decided that it is compatible. That system leads to delay and uncertainty, and hence even the EU treaty itself recognizes that block exemptions, so exemptions from the very beginning, can be adopted by the authorities, by the EU authorities that is, that contain that mean that certain categories of aid are deemed to be compatible with the internal market and notification can be avoided. So there are these what are called block exemptions that basically clear the aid at an ex ante, an anticipatory basis. But block exemptions are subject to conditions, very strict conditions, and they tend to be interpreted very strictly. The reason being that the aid is being granted in advance, and therefore, in effect, the only control that can take place happens at that particular moment. So block exemptions construed very narrowly and against the granting of aid. So moving on to the next slide, what actually, therefore, is state aid? What are its components? In fact, it is only state aid if it meets these four independent conditions. So this is a cumulative test. You only get state aid if all these ingredients are there. So there has to be what's called a transfer of state resources. The aid has to provide a selective economic advantage to one undertaking carrying on an economic activity. So we're talking about economic activity. We're talking about businesses and we're not talking about individuals. And there has to be a selective advantage. So an advantage to one particular class or group over another, hence the issue of competition unevenness. The aid has to distort or has the potential to distort competition, and the aid affects trade between member states. You might think that when you've got that bunch of ingredients there, that there are several sort of knockout blows at an early stage that mean that we're not talking about state aid, but you'd be wrong about that. And we can look at that in a little bit more detail on the next slides. So moving on, Melissa. So what is the transfer of state resources? It's broadly construed. It includes, as I've already indicated, grants, loans, but also includes things like sales at an undervalue, tax breaks, tax concessions, anything that actually basically means a variation in an ordinary level playing field. And it would certainly include funds provided as grants and loans in these circumstances. And it's likely, in my view, it would also include exemptions and exceptions from the charge. So it would include a local authority making funds available to mitigate the impact of the scheme, i.e. to facilitate the purchase of a new electric vehicle. But it would also include an exception to a certain category or class if it is felt that that's appropriate, for example, taxis, certain type of cleaner vehicle, whatever. There has to be a selective economic advantage. Again, we're talking about the ingredients for state aid actually being in place. So there has to be a selective economic advantage to certain undertakings. And they can certainly include public undertakings as well as private entities. That's absolutely clear. So you're not out of the woods because you're a local authority. It almost certainly applies to those seeking financial support or exemptions from the CAZ charge. So we're talking about HGV vehicles, taxis, white vans, all that sort of stuff, ones that people are basically in business and going into and out of that zone as part of their business activities. The issues of state aid may engage. It has to be selective, i.e. it has to apply to specific undertakings. So one of the ways you can actually avoid the impact is to make the charge available, or the mitigation, if you like, available right across the piece. For example, if you think about the UK having a general tax concession, the government imposing or granting a tax concession in certain circumstances, because it applies to the whole community, there is no distortion in the marketplace. If you think about that principle and apply it in these circumstances, you'll understand that there may be a route through under that particular head. So moving on to the other ingredients, the last two ingredients of the four, if you remember, does the aid distort competition? If the aid is selective, as I've just explained, it will, as a matter of fact, distort competition. It's assumed to distort it. That distortion doesn't have to be substantial or significant. It just has to exist. And again, furrowed brows in the last head really, does it affect trade between member states? One struggles really to understand how that might be the case in these sorts of circumstances where everything seems to be so localized in terms of local authority areas. But the starting point is that that test is easily satisfied and assumed if competition is distorted in any way. The Commission takes a broad view and generally assumes that trade between member states are affected. But there is, I think, probably room for argument if we're, again, looking for a way out of this labyrinth. There's a room for argument that this may provide, if you like, the criteria that we can challenge in terms of our four criteria overall. So moving on, the government's position. This is really what is causing the pain and the grief in terms of state aid. This is the sort of the strict view that's been taken by the Joint Air Quality Unit. They've indicated that as a condition to an application under the Clean Air Fund, a statement as to state aid implications and a summary of legal advice is necessary. That advice confirming why the proposal would not constitute state aid under EU law or why the aid is compatible aid, which is exempt from notification. So that is a strict test and a problem for local authorities. As I've indicated there, the application may simply be refused where state aid is identified and not addressed. And therefore, one has to find a specific route through the state aid problem, which undoubtedly does exist, to be comfortable and confident that you're going to get a positive response when you make your application for loan funding from the government. So moving on, how do we do that? How do we avoid state aid issues arising and meet those JAQU requirements? Sort of 4 main heads to get ourselves out of this problem. There's the question of design. It may be possible to actually design the scheme in a way that recognizes the state aid risk and sort of moves around it. For example, if you can design a scheme where you're comfortable that there is no select advantage granted to a particular class, therefore an entire category is in effect suffering the same pain, then that is a potential way through the problem. It's difficult in these circumstances to design such a scheme, however. The other ways through the problem are, in essence, the use of exemptions. I mentioned right at the beginning, if you recall, that because of the notification system and the onerous nature of it on all parties concerned, both the state and the commission has developed this idea of block exemptions. So in effect, if you fall within the conditions of the block exemption, you can simply pack up your bags and go home because you don't need to worry about state aid any longer. I mentioned also, if you remember, that the block exemption is construed very narrowly for the reason that it's an ex ante, an advance clearance. Another form of block exemption, I think, is what is known as the de minimis exemption. So the basis behind the de minimis exemption is that, as it obviously means, that if it's sufficiently small, it may not actually have the chance of disturbing a marketplace. And the question of what the size of that de minimis limit is quite complicated, but we'll talk about it in a second in more detail. But try and think of de minimis and the block exemption, GBER, the general block exemption regulation. Try and think of those as both general exemptions that we try to get ourselves into to get out of the state aid labyrinth. Legal advice, as the previous slide indicated, if you can get a lawyer to write and give absolute confidence that state aid issues either don't arise in the circumstances or have been mitigated, for example, they fall within one of those block exemptions, then that might be a way through. It's quite a difficult letter, I think, for lawyers to write, given the uncertainty in these circumstances. Ultimately, as I indicated again at the beginning, because this is a notification system and the Commission is the guardian of this exercise, the ultimate safety position to be in is to notify the Commission itself. But as we'll see, that comes with certain disadvantages, particularly in terms of timing. So moving on to the next slide, there's a little bit more about the exemptions themselves. That block exemption, it is quite limited in this context. I mentioned the sort of conditions that are in there. The only one really that we can hang a hat on in terms of plausibility in these circumstances is a part of the block exemption that applies to environmental benefit, if you like. So, but in essence, what is required is that the grant or the loan can be exempted under the block exemption if it is used for a purpose that goes above and beyond existing EU standards. So if you can make the argument that the mitigation or so the impact or whatever it might be concerned goes above and beyond the existing EU standard, you may be able to avail yourself of a certain level of comfort under the block exemption. So, for example, if funding is made available to buy electric vehicles, that might be if one can assume that an electric vehicle sets a higher standard than the current standard set out in EU regulations, if you're using the funding for that purpose, then there may be scope for the block exemption exempting that element of funding. But given the strict interpretation, as I've mentioned, it's difficult to be confident that the block exemption for these purposes is in itself an adequate tool. So looking at the next exemption, the de minimis exemption, aid is permissible under the de minimis exemption up to a value of 200,000 euros over a 3-year rolling period. So if the aid element of any grant or loan in the hands of the recipient keeps below 200,000 euros within a 3-year period, then you're in the clear. Notification is not required, and you can again go home happily comfortable that you're not in state aid territory. The thing is that is not a great amount of money when you're talking about, for example, buses or HGVs, particularly if you're talking about a business that operates more than one of them. And so the de minimis exemption has its limitations as well, particularly in the case of HGVs, because for policy reasons, that cap is reduced to 100,000 euros over a 3-year period in respect of road freight undertakings performing transport for hire or reward, and on top of that may not be used for the acquisition of new vehicles. So there is, for the obvious policy reasons of trying to reduce HGV traffic at a European level, there is a cap on this de minimis exemption in respect of either of road freight vehicles generally, and specifically in terms of purchasing new ones. So again, under that block exemption, there are some difficulties, and a lot of the ways in which we've been trying to get comfort, if you like, in terms of advising clients in this area has really been revolving around use of these exemptions and how they're appropriate in terms of certain sectors of that particular marketplace. So moving on, notification, as I mentioned, so actually telling the Commission what you're proposing to do and what the level of the grant is another route through, but there are disadvantages to this too. And I've noted there that in the current context, political issues are arising because of the need to engage the UK government. By that, I mean that a local authority on its own can't make a notification. In effect, it has to go through the government department. So the government department is the funnel through which notification to the Commission must happen. And at the moment, broadly speaking, the government has other things on its mind in this particular area. And it is difficult for the government, or to encourage the government at this point to say, look, here is a prospect of state aid. We think it's all right. Will you clear it, Commission? That is not happening at the moment, in short. In any event, notification means delay. There's normally a 3 to 9 month delay whilst the Commission consults, considers, and eventually rules on whether the state aid is compatible with the internal market or incompatible. And I think it's important, we've already touched upon it this morning, to recognize the COVID-19 situation at the moment. There is, in any event, a significant relaxation and perhaps a lack of clarity in terms of what the state aid rules are at the moment. The Commission has, as people will know, relaxed the state aid rules, and that has been mirrored and followed in, obviously, by the UK government in those sorts of circumstances. So there's a lack of clarity in that respect at the moment about how state aid applies. But I think it's clear to say that really the mechanisms by which state aid is being authorized by the Commission don't really lend themselves to this separate regime that we're talking about here. I don't think it has an absolute impact and basically lets authorities off the hook. The other important sort of message that's out there is Brexit. As you know, we're in a transition period at the moment where in effect we're still in the European Union, although we have left the European Union as a result of the repeal of the 1972 Act. But at the end of this year, the transition period expires, and it is still simply not clear. It's part of the negotiations going on at the moment, what the state aid regime is going to be post at the beginning of January next year. There may be no regime at all. We don't really know. It may be as part of the discussions that, in effect, we're pretty much where we were before, at least for a further transition period. So those issues are important. I think that's probably all I have to say. Just checking whether there's a further slide. No, that is it, I think. So state aid, it looms in the background, I'm afraid, and there aren't any particularly easy answers, particularly in a general world of uncertainty and COVID, Brexit. These are difficult questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. We're now on to our Q&A section. I'm conscious that we're reasonably close to the end of our hour, but our speaker panel can go on for a bit longer, and I think it'd be nice to have a bit of a Q&A discussion. So hopefully those of you in the audience are also willing to stay on. I have the fortune of seeing how many participants there are, so if I see a massive drop-off, then I'll perhaps bring it to an end. Anyway, 3 very interesting presentations, a lot of interest in the cat, dog and postman and woman community as we were going along there. And happily, we've also got some questions from the audience. I won't actually take them in order. I think the first question we had is probably a good end of discussion question, so I'll leave that one to the end. So I'll try and sort of group these together where possible. I think the first question will go to Rahul, was directed to you, a little bit more about the consultation process beyond what's sort of legally required and then what's advisable beyond that. Is that one that, Rahul, you can pick up? I think he may have frozen. Or is that just me? Okay, we'll come back to that one. Ashley, there was a comment on the business case requirements where a CAS is not necessarily legally required by government. Is that something you have knowledge or experience of?
I've got no view in terms of, and again, Raoul might be able to advise better, to be honest with you, Tom. But what I will say is that I thought the business case process was very robust. I think having the third party kind of endorsement of it, or review and endorsement of it, is again very robust and helps with decision making locally. And I think also, as I said on in the presentation, I think it's a great opportunity to bring an audience along with you, on a journey through that sort of interest, understanding, commitment piece, to a point where you have really properly engaged and consulted with people. I can't underestimate it. These are complex schemes. They're big changes for people in these cities. And it requires a lot of in our experience, a lot of effort needs to go into, supporting people through those changes, through that process.
Thanks, Ashley. And just given that you talked a bit about technology and the operating systems, there's an interesting question in the chat about the issue of interoperability, and one of the audience members recognising that there could be an issue with disparate schemes across the country, and how will people engage with different zones. It's quite conceivable someone could make one journey on a day from one zone to another. Have you had any sort of discussions or thoughts about that as you've set up your systems?
We have. I mean, as Raoul said, we're working within a CAS framework, which does set out some guidelines and some principles, and government has been good and quite rightly been holding us to those guidelines and principles in that CAS framework. But at the end of the day, these are local schemes generally to address sort of local issues. And it's finding that balance, I suppose, isn't it, between, meeting the national requirements, yet dealing with the issues in the local geography. I think we've reasonably struck a balance. I think it's also important to bear in mind that there is a sense in cities that the problem is coming in from outside. When I'm thinking about the clean air zones, we did some analysis of where our traffic was actually coming from, and it's quite frightening and not well known and understood that 60 to 70% of journeys in Bath are self-generated. They're coming from within Bath itself. you know, people sort of popping down to the shops and this sort of stuff. So, you know, there is a lot to be done in the local context, you know, and I think therefore, you know, we do need to find a balance. It is important that people traveling between zones understand them, and they're fairly easy to navigate, but also they do need to be tailored very much to suit that local situation, because so much traffic is local.
Thank you very much. I think Rahul's dropped off with a connection problem, so I mean I can attempt to pick up the question if I dare to do so on consultation, because I do know a little bit about that. The question that was asked was about the legal requirements for public and stakeholder consultation and what's advisable beyond that. And interestingly, I mean, particularly those who may get involved in infrastructure planning, which is increasingly picking up layer upon layer of consultation requirements. The basic legal duty to consult on a clean air zone or any charging scheme under the Transport Act 2000 is actually pretty simple. There's simply a stated duty to consult and pretty much nothing beyond that. So it's very much to the discretion of the local authority how they take that obligation forward and apply it locally. I mean, it's slightly more complicated than that, I think, as Rahul alluded to, in that any consultation under any legal regime needs to observe the general public law duties on conducting a fair consultation, which I'm sure many of the audience will be familiar with. So obviously undertaking it at a formative stage, so there's an opportunity for people to shape the proposals, allowing sufficient time for people to comment, providing sufficient materials that people can meaningfully engage, and then genuinely having regard to the information that comes back. So it's a meaningful consultation. So I guess those overlay the statutory duty, and then it's very much a matter of having regard to consultation best practice as you shape the proposals, and having regard to what's relevant for your local area. David, there's an interesting question here on the state aid side, which is, I think you referred to tax relief in your presentation, and the question that's been raised from Nick Patchett is, there a risk of the idea of a charge versus a tax could be used to undermine powers to levy a charge in the first place? I suppose, is that I think that's a question of whether the charge itself in some way distorts competition, although maybe I'm not reading it right. Do you have any thoughts on that one?
I'd like to have a chat with Nick afterwards. I'm not absolutely clear about his question here. What is absolutely right, though, is that a relief from either a tax or indeed a charge can constitute a form of state aid, and therefore it is something that one has to bear in mind and avoid the risk of that, in effect, giving a selective advantage to any particular class, as I've indicated. Could it actually undermine the powers to levy a charge in the first place? I don't think the two things do cross over. I think that the actual power to levy a charge enshrined effectively in legislation is probably immune from that risk. But certainly we could discuss that later on if that would be helpful. Thank you for the question.
Thank you. Welcome back, Rahul. Can you hear us now?
Yeah, apologies, bit of an IT failure there.
Okay, no problem. I've attempted to answer the question on consultation, but there's another question which I think you'd be well placed to have a look at. Quite an interesting question about, it was a question actually I was going to ask to Ashley about, once a scheme's in, there's a tendency for it, I guess, to expand or take on a greater form. Certainly with the London experience, that's what's happened. And it's an interesting question about, as a CAS extends into more residential areas, is there a potential issue with those owning vehicles that may get captured, which are kept to their homes, and or perhaps from a sort of income disparity perspective, those with older cars being penalised but unable to actually retrofit or improve their vehicle, not to pay the charge. Did you have any? Is that something that's come up in your work on the ULEZ?
To some extent. I mean, there were a few questions I noted in the list that I had some thoughts on. I don't know if they've already been covered. So.
Well, feel free to chip in.
There was one about a Clean Air Act, and I think you've addressed the consultation point. So I'll deal with this question first, and I'll just go back on those and give a couple of thoughts on those. Yes, this is a real issue. The clean air zones are inherently problematic in that regard, because the way they currently work and the way they have to work in order to drive change really is to set a standard for compliant vehicles, which is not achieved by all vehicles. And those that don't achieve it tend to be the poorer in society, often the more vulnerable in society, and those users of vehicles sometimes need to use the vehicles for their day-to-day life. So it does arise. It is an inherent issue in the way clean air zones operate, and it is why setting appropriate exemptions is important. And this is where it actually overlaps with the consultation process. Ideally, the consultation should seek to draw out these issues. Often, in the case of things like motorhomes, they are a commonly exempt vehicle class because of the issues that have been mentioned by the questioner. And not always, but they are a common exemption for that reason. And often these sorts of vehicles are quite unusual. So you can take a policy-based approach and say, well, look, we want to minimize the socioeconomic impacts on people as much as possible. And actually, if we say motorhomes don't pay a charge, well, there aren't very many of them. It's not going to impact hugely on air quality. So providing there's a good reason, it's something which can be addressed through consultation and through appropriate exemptions. You know, for example, you look at common exemptions include disabled vehicles, blue badge vehicles, emergency service vehicles. You can see obvious reasons why these sorts of vehicles either need to be used and or shouldn't on policy grounds pay a charge. And I'm not sure that that's necessarily dependent on how big the zone is, though I suppose when you look at something like Greater Manchester, it's going to be a clean air zone, the whole of Greater Manchester. It's inherently more of a problem than just a city centre where there are, I suppose, by definition, fewer residents. You look at central London, there are far fewer residents. So I guess that is an issue, and that will continue to be an issue. But hopefully it can be addressed through the exemption process. Just a couple of other points then that may have been picked up on, but I just had a couple of thoughts. The consultation question, for those who are interested, looking at the section of the Act now, it's section 170, and the duty is to consult such persons and such representatives of local persons as the authority considers appropriate about the charging scheme. So it's a very light touch duty, but it's a risk mitigation point. You've got to hit your public law criteria. Tom, you probably mentioned.
Yeah, I mentioned those.
So that's really how it works. But the actual legal duty is pretty light touch, so you've got to address your mind to those public law criteria. Will there be a comprehensive Clean Air Act? When will there be? I think the answer is not in the foreseeable future. I think the government would argue that the Clean Air Strategy for 2019 and the Environment Bill, current Environment Bill, effectively do that job. I'm not convinced that they do, though there has been some progress. So the Environment Bill includes an Office for Environmental Protection to sort of step into the Commission's shoes with regards to enforcement. And in August of this year, there was a consultation paper on setting binding environmental targets so that there will be some genuine teeth, and if targets aren't met, complaints can be made. I still don't think that's a comprehensive solution, because the process for the enforcement of these is essentially judicial review and going to court, as far as I can see. There isn't a sort of expedited process, isn't a system of fines or easy enforcement procedures, though I haven't kept up to date on all of the recent proposals. And the Environment Bill itself has been out of Parliament for sort of 9 months or so. So I think that's what the government would argue. I'm not sure it is completely comprehensive, but that's where we are on that. I think those were the main ones I saw that were within my wheelhouse. So happy to pick up any others I've missed.
Thanks, Rahul. Ashley, I think you wanted to come in on the issue of the exemptions, expanded zones, etc. Just on mute still.
Yeah, I was just reflecting on our kind of local experience of going through the consultation and sort of practically, as it were, and a couple of things that we recognised or kind of responded to. I think in terms of this point around disproportionate impact, I think we we tend to forget it's not, you know, Euro 4, 5 and 6 vehicles, particularly petrol, you know, are exempt under the CAS framework. And they take us back to 2006. So they're vehicles that are 14 years old now. You know, so probably a lot of those people who are potentially disproportionately affected are captured, you know, their vehicles are captured just within, you know, just the fact that they're, you know, they're within that 14-year kind of limit. You know, all those people could, with a little support perhaps, you know, move across to a vehicle that would be compliant. Certainly in terms of the CAS framework, I can't speak in terms of the ULEZ. I think in terms of motorhomes and also camper vans, if I might, we recognise the issue there, and so we proposed, and in fact we're implementing a discount for larger motorhomes down from £100 to £9. So there is still some charge, but it's very heavily discounted, recognising that sort of leisure use. But at the end of the day, you know, we have to remember that all vehicles are polluting, even the Euro 6 ones that we're still allowing, if they're diesel, the Euro 4, 5 and 6, which are petrol, you know. And as I said in the presentation, I think it is very important that we don't sort of take the pressure off, you know, all sectors and all parts of, you know, of society, you know, where it's reasonable that they could either afford the charge or afford to upgrade. You know, that's pretty much a principle for us. On a lighter note, just one other thing that's sort of a bit anecdotal, and picking up on sort of camper vans particularly, we're very mindful of the Severn Bridge experience, where you know, if you had windows in the back of your van, you know, you could get through without paying the charge. And so we were very mindful on a sort of lighter note to, you know, not start to go down the slippery slope of everyone suddenly having windows in the back of their van, you know, and therefore escaping the charge. So you know, these sorts of precedents, I suppose, also need to be borne in mind, you know, from around the country.
Thanks, Ashley. Looking at the time, we'll perhaps have one more Q&A. Rahul, back to you, actually. I think this is one that you might usefully pick up on as well. Question about the business case and review requirements in the case of a mandated CAS or LES, and where one isn't. And yeah, what's your experience of that?
A good point. I mean, in essence, those requirements only apply where a CAS is mandated. I think I sort of touched on the fact that if there is no direction under the 95 Act to implement a clean air zone, it is open to any local traffic authority to implement any zone of this nature. And there is no central government role at all. There used to be an approval role for the Secretary of State, but there isn't now. The local authority simply decides its scheme, makes the order and implements. Now, the quid pro quo is that it will have to fund that scheme itself. There may be other funding mechanisms which you may wish to use to support that. For example, clean bus technology funding to help upgrade buses, and that can be done independently. It's often done alongside clean air zone funding applications, but it can be done without that. So there are other pots of funding. Also, there's funding for upgrading the electric infrastructure, OLED funding and the like. So there are other funding sources, and that they will come with their own strings attached. But in theory, if you wish to implement a zone of your own, you simply implement your zone.
Thank you very much. Well, we've gone a bit over time. Thanks for sticking with us. So we'll wrap things up there. First of all, thanks to our speakers, and particularly to you, Ashley, for providing the local authority perspective. And thanks to all of you who've joined us today for listening and asking some interesting questions. We'll be sending around a bit of a wrap-up email with a link to a video of today's recording and a copy of the slides, so you can share those with colleagues should you wish to. And we'll have a look at the questions in the link there, and if there's anything we haven't picked up, we'll try and pick that up too. So with that, it's goodbye from me and the panel, and we very much hope to see you again at one of our future webinars.